make sure that I touch on this subject because I saw this kind of roll through my YouTube feed the other day, and I instantly watched the entire thing. It was the most recent Eavesdrop podcast where Hex essentially had Crimsix on and talked on a number of different things. He talked on the Dallas Empire's win, talked on a few other kind of subjects that are going on within the Call of Duty community, and he also talked on the Scump rivalry, which was huge to start last season. Again, there were a lot of different things coming into launch weekend. When we first started, the first event of franchising, the Minnesota launch weekend, there was a lot of major storylines, and I almost feel as if that the storyline of even Optic transitioning to Energy Chicago Huntsmen, which I know is currently a talking point right now, but just in general back then, it probably wasn't even as big as the major rivalry that was developing between the Dallas Empire and the Chicago Huntsmen. And a lot of that developed between two prior players, that being Scump and that being Crimsix. Two guys who have been with each other leading up into this event for the last 5 titles. They were part of the Dynasty together. They won a world championship together back in 2017. And essentially, Crimsix kind of went more in depth on how he feels that the rivalry that was portrayed by the media, the rivalry that was portrayed by people who were creating content, that he was kind of painted in a light that he doesn't feel was accurate, and kind of went more in depth on how everything kind of came to light, if you will. And for those that need a little bit of a refresher, essentially kind of what took place. And again, this is Crim's opinion. You have to be wary of that as someone who covers stories like this. I always try to be careful to make sure that the other side is known. But again, this is directly coming from Crim. He essentially kind of talked about the ending of what happened from Black Ops 4 into Modern Warfare. He was supposed to be on the Optic team. He wanted to be with Scump and Hex coming into franchising. He was told that was the case. And then what essentially happened, what I remember most, is that an ultimatum came about from a majority of the players saying that they didn't want to play with Crim kind of coming into the next year. And what's sounds like occurred is that Scump didn't exactly kind of stand up for him. And so what Crim is saying in this situation, when he leaves the Chicago Huntsmen, leaves Optic coming into the Chicago Huntsmen, he goes over to the Empire. His biggest debate or kind of frustration that he had about this rivalry was that, again, it wasn't painted in the right light. He feels, and it's accurate, that he was painted or spinned as the bad guy, when in reality, from his position, he feels as if it should be the other way around, right? Because Crim, and I will say this, I want to instantly address the reason why I believe that Crim was addressed as the bad guy. First off, when we talk about this situation in particular, a lot of noise instantly came from Crimsix, right? He started releasing quite a few statements about the situation. He made it known that a few different comments had come around. I remember in his original release, it wasn't directly negative towards Scump or Hex. I think it was kind of directly talking on the majority of players. So there wasn't really an instant connection with Crim and Scump. It was an instant connection, in my eyes, with Crim and Optic, who would later obviously turn into NRG and, whatever you have you. And I will say there wasn't really a whole lot of publicized chatter from the other side. And that's what I feel like kind of made this situation turn into the way that it was, because it wasn't necessarily, oh, Crim is the villain, to start off, but it was, hey, Crim is the one talking and has the right to do so. And I feel like that is what kind of allowed him to be put into this position of the bad guy, because when you have one guy who was talking, and rightfully so, and the other side really isn't commenting all that much on it, it kind of paints this light of, well, why is this guy being attacked for a situation that isn't currently known to the public? And I feel like Clayster and Crim specifically, the Empire as a whole, kind of embraced what was this certain mentality, because you have somebody who in Crim, right, is not happy about the current situation that he's in. He reunites with Clay back from the glory days on Complexity. Clay, in the same situation, is also coming from an E United team that he's gone on to tell me a few different times. He was surprised that he didn't get to play with the Twins. He was surprised that the whole roster didn't actually stick together, and that Simp and Abizi didn't actually want to play with him coming into the next year. So you have two guys who are kind of in some ways a little bit frustrated with their situation and who are motivated to try and change the narrative. And I feel like that motivation through different tweets and through different content pieces and stuff kind of made it frame them as if they were the bad guy. Whether you believe it or not, whether it's accurate or not, that's kind of the way that it began to be portrayed. And again, from a fan perspective, it is difficult to frame what is, you know, I'll say this. It is hard to frame Optic as the villain because they have such a great connection. And I know I'm saying Optic, but you get my point. We're talking in past tense. It is hard to frame that audience and try to portray to them that who they support and who is kind of their figurehead, of, if you will, and they're the people that they support. It's hard to get them as the villain, right? Whenever you are a massive supporter of a team, when you're watching, you know, let's say you're watching football, your favorite team gets a really good call, probably a call that they didn't deserve. Your instant reaction isn't to say, oh, well, screw that, right? That was a horrible call for my team. No, your instant reaction is to say, well, you know, great call for us. Your instant reaction isn't to try and instantly sway your team or to try to be negative toward your team. No, because they're your team. You have something invested in them. And that's the same way that the audience works for Optic and now the Chicago Huntsmen. It works the exact same way. And when it came down to different audio sound bites and stuff that came from the Dallas Empire, which I thought were great, it was a matter of, you know, I will never forgive and I will never forget, right? That was the quote. And again, I think that that has the ability to be spun in a few different ways. And from the Optic audience, who again is in kind of this sports mentality when it comes down to thinking that in certain aspects that nothing can kind of be negative toward their team, the instant reaction is to say, oh, well, that's wrong, right? That's the wrong aspect. That's the wrong way that Crim is thinking about this. And I think that Crim brought up some really interesting points throughout this podcast. And it is always interesting to kind of hear more about this because I know the Huntsmen kind of started to make fun of it. You know, Chicago just in general kind of made, you know, memes about the Crimsix video. You saw Scump do that at the end of the NRG announcement for the Huntsmen as well. A number of different things, right? But I will say that Crim brought up a few different key moments throughout this interview that I thought were excellent. And one of those was kind of this mentality and this aspect that he had was when he said, I technically stayed with Scump and decided to kind of stay with him, chose to be with him in World War II, which was his worst title, but yet he didn't choose to stay with me after my worst in Black Ops 4. And he also went on to say throughout this interview that Scump was supposed to be the best man at his wedding. And that is very interesting because when you talk about these two players, like I said, who stuck together for such a long time, right? When we forget the dynasty, when they collapsed, right? When the dynasty collapsed in World War II, it was Scump and it was Crimsix who stayed together, right? It was those two who moved forward to try and rebuild what was the Green Wall, right? And that was essentially their task. That was their goal. They were the ones who were communicating. They were talking about the Karma situation. They handled the formal situation of which he wanted to be traded. Or they were there together through all of that. And so you kind of hear little sound bites like this. You hear quotes like this. And it really makes you realize how close they were together. And that is why this rivalry is so interesting, is because of the history that they have together. And based on how Crimsix was talking and based on the way that things seem right now, is that they still aren't in the greatest of places. And I don't think this looks great on Scump overall, especially when you hear a few of these quotes and the way that he's kind of defending himself. And I know Hex kind of throughout made sure that he didn't want to play devil's advocate. He didn't want to be on the side of Scump because he wanted to give Crim the ability to speak his piece, which I think is important. But I do think that we will later on hear more about this. I think this is kind of set up for a future, podcast, obviously, with them. I think we are eventually going to see Scump address this in some capacity if it ends up getting big enough, which I think that it will. But again, you have to consider the history that these guys have with one another. That is the reason why the storyline was so big coming into launch weekend. That is the reason why the storyline only continues to exist, because previously in Call of Duty history, we've had some big rivalries between players, especially players that have been associated with Optic and been on the same team of Scump, etc. But they usually start to fizzle out after a few months. And there's a reason why this one is so deeply ingrained. There is a reason why this one still exists, and that is because of the personal connection that those two guys had together, and it will remain an underlying story moving forward, because we talked about Huntsmen versus Empire, the history between those brands, the E-Classico between Envy and Optic, right? Hastro versus Hex. I mean, a number of different situations throughout Call of Duty's history, and it only continues to live, especially when we talk about storylines and rivalries such as this one.